By the end of 1944, the Soviet Union had issued nearly 400,000 sniper rifles to trained shooters on the Eastern Front. Germany, in the same period, fielded a fraction of that. The Wehrmacht had walked into Russia in 1941, assuming German snipers were the best in the world. They were not wrong about the men. They were wrong about how many men Stalin had already trained and what he had handed them. The rifle was the Mosin-Nagant M91/30 with a PU scope. What made it deadly was not the rifle itself. It was the system that put it in 400,000 pairs of hands. To understand why the Wehrmacht was so badly caught out by Soviet snipers, you have to look at what German doctrine actually said about sniping in 1941. Germany entered the Second World War with one of the most respected sharpshooter traditions in Europe. The standard German sniper rifle was the Karabiner 98K bolt-action, fitted with a Zielfernrohr 39 or later the ZF4 scope. German sniper schools produced trained Scharfschützen who were considered specialist troops, assigned to infantry battalions in small numbers, usually 1 or 2 per company. They were excellent shots. German sniper doctrine emphasized careful positioning, careful identification, and careful conservation of ammunition. The Scharfschütze was a precision tool, used sparingly. The assumption underneath the doctrine was that this was how proper sniping worked. The Allies and the Soviets, the Germans believed, did not have the same tradition or the same quality of marksman. France's defeat in 1940 had partly confirmed this. French snipers had been few in number and poorly equipped. Polish snipers in 1939 had been overrun before they could matter. In June 1941, when Operation Barbarossa launched and German troops crossed into Soviet territory, the Wehrmacht's intelligence assessment of Soviet small arms capability followed the same logic. The Red Army was rated as numerous but poorly trained. Soviet officers were rated as ideologically purged and tactically incompetent. Soviet snipers, where they were mentioned at all, were treated as a footnote. That assessment held for about 6 months. By the winter of 1941, German company commanders on the Eastern Front were reporting something the intelligence summaries had not prepared them for. Soviet snipers were everywhere, on every sector, at every elevation, and the Wehrmacht's own veterans were already calling them the most feared element of Red Army infantry. To understand what the Soviets were actually carrying, you have to start with a rifle the Tsars had ordered into production in 1891. The Mosin-Nagant was not a modern weapon. The original design, by Sergei Ivanovich Mosin with input from the Belgian Nagant brothers, had been adopted by the Imperial Russian Army in 1891. It was a 5-shot bolt-action rifle chambered in 7.62 by 54mm rimmed, a cartridge that would outlive the Soviet Union itself. The action was simple. The trigger was heavy. The barrel was long. Nothing about the rifle was elegant, and almost nothing about it had been changed in 50 years. What the Soviets did, starting in 1930, was standardize a slightly shorter and lighter version called the M91/30. It used the same cartridge, the same action, and the same general profile. Across the Second World War, Soviet factories at Tula and Izhevsk built more than 17 million M91/30s. By 1942, they were rolling off the production line at a rate no German factory could come close to. There was a quality the Mosin-Nagant had that the more sophisticated rifles of other armies sometimes did not. It was almost impossible to break. If you were a Soviet armorer in a field workshop, you could fix a battered M91/30 with parts pulled from another battered M91/30. The trigger could be adjusted, the bolt could be retightened. In the mud and freezing temperatures of the Eastern Front, where German weapons were seizing and Soviet vehicles were being scavenged for fuel, the Mosin-Nagant kept firing. But none of this would have made the rifle particularly dangerous on its own. The Wehrmacht had captured plenty of basic bolt-action rifles in the campaigns before Russia. What the Soviets did next, in 1942, was the part the Germans had not anticipated, and the part that would make a 50-year-old rifle into one of the most feared weapons of the war. What made the M91/30 into a sniper rifle was not the rifle. It was a piece of cheap pressed steel and 3.5 power glass. You see, the Soviets had been experimenting with scoped Mosin-Nagants since the early 1930s. The first variant, called the PE, used a 4-power scope mounted on top of the receiver. It worked, but it was complex, slow to produce, and prevented the rifle from being loaded with stripper clips. In 1942, with German offensives still pressing into the Soviet heartland and demand for trained snipers climbing in every sector, the Red Army adopted a simpler design. They called it the PU, short for Pritzl Universalny, the universal sight. The PU scope had a 3.5 times magnification. It was mounted on a side rail, offset to the left of the receiver on a turned-down bolt handle so you could still cycle the action with your right hand. It had a simple post and crosshair reticle and elevation drums calibrated out to 1,000 meters. The whole assembly was cheap, durable, and could be produced in numbers no German optical factory could match. By the end of 1942, Soviet factories were producing the M91/30 PU at a rate of 53,000 rifles per year. By the end of 1944, close to 400,000 had been built. The German sniper variant of the Kar 98K, in comparison, was produced in numbers measured in tens of thousands across the entire war. The Soviets were not just outshooting the Germans, they were out-manufacturing them by a factor that mattered. A rifle is only as useful as the person pointing it. What turned the PU sniper rifle from a production statistic into the most feared weapon on the Eastern Front was the school the Soviets opened in March 1942, in a village outside Moscow on Stalin's direct order. There is one part of the Soviet sniper story that the Wehrmacht did not learn about until it was already happening to them. In March 1942, with German armies less than 100 kilometers from Moscow and the Eastern Front in its worst crisis, Stalin ordered the establishment of a central school for sniper instructors. It was set up in the village of Wehrmacht, just east of Moscow. The school was state-funded, state-equipped, and reported directly to the Red Army's main training directorate. Its purpose was not to produce a handful of elite shooters. Its purpose was to train the men and women who would themselves train tens of thousands more. In December 1942, the school added a separate program. It was a 3-month course, specifically for women. The Soviet command had discovered in the chaotic months following Operation Barbarossa that female recruits with hunting backgrounds, or simply with the patience and steady nerves the work required, could outshoot many of their male counterparts. The women's program at Wehrmacht ran 7 full courses across the war. If you were a woman who had passed the entrance tests, you spent 3 months learning every skill the Soviet sniper doctrine required, and then went to the front as both a shooter and a junior instructor. Across the entire war, the Soviet Union deployed 2,484 women in the sniper role. About 500 of them survived. What most people don't realize about the Soviet program is that the difference from the German one was not the rifle, it was the doctrine. German Scharfschützen were specialist troops attached to a battalion in small numbers. Soviet snipers were treated as infantry. They moved with the line. They entered urban combat alongside rifle squads. They were used as offensive shock troops as much as defensive overwatch. By the time the Wehrmacht reached Stalingrad in the late summer of 1942, the school at Wehrmacht had been running for 6 months. The first wave of trained snipers was already in the field, the deadly result of state planning that had begun 6 months earlier. What that meant in practice would arrive in German company morning reports within weeks. There is one part of the Soviet sniper story that the surviving Wehrmacht veterans of Stalingrad could not forget after the war. By the autumn of 1942, the Battle of Stalingrad had become the largest urban combat operation in human history. Both armies fought house by house, floor by floor, through factories, apartment blocks, and rubble fields that changed hands within hours. The Soviet sniper doctrine, the one developed at Wehrmacht and refined across 6 months of Eastern Front combat, was tailor-made for that kind of fighting. Vasily Zaitsev, a former shepherd from the Ural Mountains, had been issued an M91/30 PU and was operating in the rubble of the Lazur chemical plant by September 1942. By the end of the battle, he had recorded 225 confirmed kills. The men he had personally trained, working in pairs and small teams across the city, were credited with killing approximately 6,000 German soldiers in 5 months of fighting. Zaitsev's name became a propaganda fixture in the Soviet press. Inside the 6th Army, German company commanders began including a new category in their daily reports: casualties to sniper fire. If you were a German officer at Stalingrad in October 1942, the morning ritual of stepping outside your dugout to check the front had become one of the most dangerous things you would do that day. And that's not the only sector where the doctrine was doing what it had been built to do. Lyudmila Pavlichenko, a history student from Kyiv who had volunteered in 1941, had been issued an M91/30 PU in the defense of Odessa and Sevastopol. By the time Sevastopol fell in June 1942, she had recorded 309 confirmed kills, including 36 enemy snipers sent specifically to find and eliminate her. Stalin pulled her out of combat, made her a propaganda symbol, and sent her on a tour to the United States. The American press called her Lady Death. The Wehrmacht had a different name. They called her Marked, the way they called every Soviet sniper marked, and they spent the rest of the war trying to catch up. But here's the thing about an army that has been outshot for 2 years. Eventually, it tries to catch up. By the spring of 1943, the Wehrmacht had finally acknowledged what its own veterans had been reporting since the previous winter. The Soviets were winning the sniper war, and they were winning it at industrial scale. Germany's response was scattered. Sniper schools were expanded. The Carabiner 98K sniper variant production was prioritized. New scope designs, including the 4-power ZF4 derived from the Gewehr 43 program, were rushed into service. Wehrmacht counter-sniper teams were organized to find and eliminate Soviet shooters in specific sectors. None of these measures came close to matching what the Soviet system had been producing for the previous 18 months. If you were in the German command structure in 1943, you knew you were 18 months behind on a curve that was still climbing. The most famous example of the German reaction was the alleged duel between Vasily Zaitsev and a German major named Erwin König, sent from Berlin specifically to kill him. The story was, and remains, one of the most repeated tales of the Stalingrad campaign. Whether König actually existed is another matter. No German military record from the period mentions a Major Erwin König attached to any Stalingrad sniper unit. The story may have been Soviet propaganda. It may have been an embellished account of a real duel with a different officer. What it certainly was the kind of story the Wehrmacht needed for its own morale, and the kind of story that confirmed how seriously German command had begun to take the Soviet sniper threat. The Mosin-Nagant M91/30 PU stayed in Soviet service for decades after the war. It was issued in the Korean War, in Vietnam, and in conflicts across the Cold War and after it. The school at Veshniaki kept training snipers into the 1960s. The deadly system Stalin had built in 1942 outlived him, outlived the Soviet Union, and influenced sniper doctrine in every army that came after. The Soviet sniper system that broke the Wehrmacht's confidence on the Eastern Front was built on a school, a doctrine, and 400,000 rifles. But the system also produced individuals. The most deadly of them was a 25-year-old history student named Lyudmila Pavlichenko, and how she survived 309 confirmed kills is its own story. It's on screen now.